Somewhere in the middle of America, in a state most people fly over without a second thought, a woman gave birth to 7 children in under 10 minutes. Not twins. Not triplets. 7. All at once. All alive. All breathing. That single morning in November of 1997 rewrote what the medical world believed was survivable, and it put a quiet, unremarkable family from a town most people had never heard of directly into the center of a national firestorm that they never asked for, never anticipated, and never fully escaped. The cameras eventually left. The satellite trucks eventually drove away. The magazine covers eventually got replaced by newer faces and newer controversies. And 7 tiny human beings who had arrived in the world as a collective noun, as a phenomenon, as a statistic, grew up into something far more interesting than any of that. They grew up into people. Ordinary, complicated, quietly remarkable people. And that is the story we are going to tell today. But to understand where they ended up, you have to understand where they started. And where they started is not in a hospital room. It is years earlier, in a different kind of quiet. The quiet of a couple trying and failing and trying again to build the family they had always imagined. Bobby and Kenny McCaughey lived in Carlisle, Iowa, a small town of a few thousand people set into the flat agricultural landscape of the American Midwest. Carlisle is the kind of place where the seasons are dramatic and the lives are modest, where people work steady jobs, go to church on Sundays, and measure a good life not by what they accumulate but by what they build together. Kenny worked at a local car dealership. He also served as a deacon at the couple's Baptist church, a role that placed faith at the absolute center of how he understood the world and his place in it. Bobby, his wife, was soft-spoken and deeply devout, a woman who did not make decisions loudly or impulsively but who, when she arrived at a conclusion, held it with a kind of unshakable calm that would later leave doctors puzzled and journalists reaching for words they didn't quite have. What this couple wanted, more than almost anything, was a family, not fame. Not headlines. Not a place in medical textbooks. Just children. A house that smelled like dinner and sounded like noise and felt like something that would outlast them. A simple dream, the kind millions of couples carry quietly through their 20s. The problem was that Bobby's body had other ideas. She had a condition involving her pituitary gland, the small but essential structure at the base of the brain that, among its many functions, sends the hormonal signals that regulate ovulation. When that system doesn't work properly, conception becomes difficult or sometimes impossible without medical intervention. For Bobby and Kenny, the road to parenthood was not a straight line. It was a long, emotionally exhausting process of trying and waiting and grieving, month after month, the pregnancy that didn't come. The particular grief of infertility is one that tends to be carried privately. It sits at the dinner table and doesn't say much. It rides in the car on Sunday mornings to church. It is present at every baby shower you attend for someone else, smiling and clapping while something inside you goes very quiet. Their first daughter, Michaela, arrived only after that long battle, after medical intervention and patience and hope that had been stretched almost to its limit. And when she came, she was everything. But Bobby looked at her daughter and wanted to give her a companion, a sibling, someone to grow up alongside, to argue with and laugh with and share the experience of childhood. So they returned to their doctors. And because Bobby's body still needed help to do what other women's bodies did on their own, she was prescribed a fertility medication designed to stimulate ovulation, to coax the system into doing what the signals from her brain were not reliably doing on their own. This was not an exotic or unusual decision. Fertility treatments are part of the landscape of modern medicine. Millions of couples walk through those doors and take those medications and go home and wait and hope. The vast majority of them have twin pregnancies, or singleton pregnancies, or no pregnancy at all. It is routine. It is private. It is one of the most human things there is. There was nothing about Bobby McCaughey's situation that suggested it would become anything other than a quiet chapter in an ordinary family story. And then came the ultrasound. The room where it happened was small and dim, the way those rooms tend to be. The monitor glows brighter when the lights are low. Bobby lay back on the examination table, and the technician applied the cold gel to her abdomen and pressed the transducer gently against her skin. Kenny sat beside her. This was supposed to be a routine early scan, the kind of appointment that produces a blurry image, a fast small heartbeat on the screen, and a due date written on a small card to take home. The technician found the first heartbeat. Good. Expected. She moved the wand. She found another. Twins weren't unheard of with this kind of medication. She moved again. A third. She paused. She adjusted her grip. She leaned closer to the monitor. A fourth. The room went very still in the particular way rooms go still when something is happening that no one has the training or the vocabulary to handle gracefully. A fifth. A sixth. The technician counted again because when a number feels impossible, you count again. And then she found the seventh. 7 heartbeats. 7 separate flickering pulses on the screen. Each one distinct. Each one real. Each one attached to a life that was just beginning. The technician counted a second time. The number was the same. Bobby and Kenny left that appointment carrying information that no couple in the history of recorded medicine had ever carried home before in quite the same way. 7 viable pregnancies. All at once. All in one body. All demanding to be fed and sheltered and brought safely into the world. The medical team that surrounded them in the days that followed was careful and measured and genuinely concerned. What they had to tell this young couple from Carlisle, Iowa was not easy to say, and it was not easy to hear. High-order multiple pregnancies, meaning pregnancies carrying many babies at once, had a history that was not kind. Prematurity was nearly Satan. The complications that came with extreme prematurity, underdeveloped lungs, neurological vulnerabilities, and the cascade of medical crises that could follow, were documented in the literature, and they were sobering. And the risk was not only to the babies. Carrying 7 children simultaneously placed enormous strain on a woman's body. Bobby's blood pressure, her organs, her cardiovascular system, all of it would be under pressures that human physiology was not designed to sustain for long. The doctors had a recommendation. It was called selective reduction. It was a procedure in which some of the pregnancies would be ended, deliberately and carefully, so that the remaining babies would have more space, more nutrition, more time inside the womb, and a statistically better chance at survival and health. The doctors who made this recommendation were not without compassion. They were not indifferent to what they were asking. They were looking at the numbers, at the outcomes data, at what prematurity does to the bodies of children born far too early. They were trying, in the way that medicine always tries, to optimize for survival, to do the most good with the least harm. But Bobby and Kenny were not looking at numbers. Or rather, they were looking at a different kind of number. 7. Not a statistic. 7. Their children. All 7 of them, already present on that screen, already flickering with life, already theirs in the way that a child is yours the moment you know they exist. Their faith was not an abstraction. It was the frame through which they understood everything, including this. And within that frame, selective reduction was not a medical decision. It was a moral one. It was a question of which of their children they were willing to lose, and the answer, arrived at together and without apparent hesitation, was none of them. Bobby would later describe the impossible position the recommendation put her in with words that were plain and devastating. She asked, essentially, for someone to come and look at her children and tell her which one she should never have had. No one could answer that question. No one was meant to answer it. It was not a question with an answer. It was a question that revealed the limits of what any framework, medical or otherwise, can demand of a parent. The pregnancy that followed was not a triumph of ease. It was a sustained physical ordeal. Bobby's belly expanded to dimensions that are difficult to imagine and impossible to forget once you have heard them described. The weight of carrying 7 babies simultaneously pressed against her lungs, her spine, her diaphragm. She could not move freely. She could not stand without assistance. For months, she was essentially confined to bed in a hospital setting, monitored around the clock by a team of specialists who understood that every additional day the babies remained in the womb was a gift paid for in physical cost to their mother. She could feel all 7 of them moving. 7 separate rhythms. 7 distinct presences. She would count them to reassure herself. The way other expectant mothers count kicks. She counted 7 sets of kicks. 7 reminders that they were still there, still growing, still fighting for the time they needed. The news had leaked out, as news of the extraordinary always does. Reporters began calling. Camera crews appeared near the house in Carlisle. A couple who had simply wanted to give their daughter a sibling found themselves at the center of a national conversation about reproductive medicine, about religious faith, about what individuals owe to the medical establishment, and about what the medical establishment owes to individual conscience. It was not a conversation they had sought. It was not one they were fully prepared for. But it was happening, whether they were ready for it or not. November 19, 1997. Approximately 9 weeks before what would have been a full-term delivery. The decision about when the babies would be born was no longer entirely in anyone's hands. The medical team determined that the moment had arrived. The births needed to happen now. The operating room that was prepared for Bobby McCaughey's delivery looked, by the accounts of those who were present, less like a standard medical suite and more like a small city had moved in. Approximately 40 medical professionals packed into that space: doctors, nurses, neonatal specialists, respiratory therapists, anesthesiologists, pediatric surgeons on standby. 7 separate teams, each assigned to one baby. 7 warming stations. 7 sets of tiny instruments and oxygen equipment. The lights were surgical and bright, and the air was the particular brand of charged stillness that exists when people who are very good at what they do are preparing to do the hardest version of it. The cesarean section began. And what happened next happened with remarkable speed. In roughly 6 minutes, 7 children were delivered. Kenneth, Alexis, Natalie, Kelsey, Brandon, Nathan, and Joel. 4 boys and 3 girls. Each one lifted from the operating table and carried immediately to a waiting team. Each one weighed, assessed, and placed in the care of specialists whose only job in that moment was to keep that one specific baby alive. The birth weights were small. The smallest of the 7 weighed just over 2 pounds. The largest approached 4. Together, all 7 babies combined weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 pounds. Each one of them was smaller than a loaf of bread. Each one had translucent skin through which you could see the fine network of veins beneath. Each one had lungs that were not finished developing, lungs that did not yet know how to expand and contract on their own to pull in oxygen and push out carbon dioxide, the single most essential thing a living body must do. They were placed in incubators in the neonatal intensive care unit. 7 clear plastic enclosures, each warmed and monitored, each containing one child who was fighting, in the only way available to a being that small and new, to become strong enough to survive. Monitors beeped. Ventilators breathed for babies who could not breathe for themselves. Nurses bent over those incubators for hours at a stretch. Bobby and Kenny drove back and forth between the hospital and home, scrubbing their hands carefully before they were allowed to reach through the small access portals in the sides of the incubators and lay a single finger against a chest no wider than the bowl of a spoon. The controversy that had surrounded their decision did not disappear once the babies were born. If anything, the very visibility of 7 tiny infants in 7 incubators intensified it. Letters arrived at the hospital, at the family's home, from strangers all over the country. Most were warm. Some were not. Some accused the McCaughey's of recklessness, of selfishness, of placing an unreasonable burden on medical resources that could have been used elsewhere. People who had never met them and would never meet them felt entitled to weigh in on a decision the family had made in private, in prayer, on the basis of values that were entirely their own to hold. But there was another America visible in those weeks too. Strangers drove to Carlisle for no reason other than to leave something on the porch. Food, diapers, handmade blankets, cards with no return address. People wrote to say they were praying. Volunteers came to the house and asked shyly if they could sit with a baby for a while. A larger home was eventually built and donated to accommodate a family of that size. A van large enough to transport everyone. A state university system that quietly arranged scholarship commitments for all 7 children before any of them had learned to walk. The country was arguing with itself about the McCaughey's and also, quietly, taking care of them. 1 year after the births, the family sat across from Oprah Winfrey in a television studio and showed America what 7 surviving septuplets looked like at 12 months old. It was a different kind of famous than November had been. Less medical emergency, more ordinary joy. 7 babies who had spent their first months in incubators were now sitting up, rolling over, reaching for things, doing the 1,000 small and remarkable things that babies do when they are growing the way babies are supposed to grow. But the quieter truth was also beginning to emerge. The truth that the doctors had tried to describe in that consultation room years before. Extreme prematurity leaves marks. Not always. Not on everyone. But often enough, and seriously enough, that the risk the medical team had named was a real one, not a scare tactic designed to frighten a young couple into a decision they weren't prepared to make. 2 of the 7, Alexis and Nathan, had developed cerebral palsy. Both of them used walkers as children. Nathan, in particular, faced significant orthopedic challenges and required spinal surgery in 2005. These were real consequences. They were not erasable by the warmth of the ending or the fact that all 7 had survived. They were part of the story, and they belonged in it with the same weight as everything else. Alexis and Nathan did not disappear into those challenges. They moved through them, with the support of their family, with their own particular stubbornness, with the same bedrock refusal to accept limits that had characterized their mother's decision years before they were born. They built lives. It took longer in some areas. It required more work. It demanded more of them than it demanded of the siblings who had been spared those specific difficulties. But they did it, and the siblings who watched them do it described the experience, not with the language of tragedy, but with the language of pride. The kind of pride that only comes from knowing exactly how much something cost. So what does all of this look like now? Almost 3 decades later. Here are 7 people who arrived in the world as a single impossible event and have since become, one by one, themselves. Kenneth McCaughey Jr., the firstborn of the 7, has built a life with his hands. He works as a carpenter, crafting cabinets and furniture in Iowa. He is married to a woman named Cynthia, and he is a father himself now. The boy who was carried out of an operating room, weighing a couple of pounds, is a man who builds things meant to last. There is something fitting about that. Brandon McCaughey took a path that bent towards service. He joined the United States Army and has risen to the rank of sergeant. He married in 2019. The child who was statistically unlikely to survive his first week is now a soldier, which is its own kind of statement about the durability of human beings when they are given a fighting chance. Joel McCaughey moved into the world of information technology. He works for a manufacturing company, one of the millions of people who keep the technological infrastructure of American industry running from behind a screen. He is the quiet presence in the group, by most accounts, the one who does not seek the spotlight, which is perhaps understandable given how much spotlight arrived before he had any say in the matter. Nathan McCaughey, who used to walk as a child, who underwent spinal surgery as a teenager, who lived with cerebral palsy in a body that made ordinary things more complicated than they had any right to be, earned a degree in computer information systems. He works in technology in Des Moines. He lives independently. He drives himself to work. His sister Alexis has spoken about watching him build that life, and called it something she finds genuinely wonderful to witness. Not because she expected less of him, but because she knows exactly what it took. Natalie McCaughey pursued exercise science. She became a certified athletic trainer and eventually rose to the position of head athletic trainer at the college in Missouri that had offered all 7 of the McCaughey Septuplets full scholarships when they were still infants. She is pursuing a graduate degree. She married a man she met on that campus. She has a young son. The child who spent her first months in an incubator now helps other people care for their bodies and recover from physical setbacks. The shape of that arc is not accidental. Kelsey McCaughey explored music for a time before finding her footing in public relations. She works as a receptionist in a medical office in Missouri. She and her husband Kevin have adopted a son. Kelsey has tended to be among the more private of the 7, which may explain why her story feels like the one least often told. She seems, from what is publicly known, to be living exactly the life she chose, which is the best outcome anyone can describe. Alexis McCaughey grew up with cerebral palsy. She navigated childhood with a body that required more effort in more directions than her siblings. She earned a college degree in liberal arts, and she turned her lifelong love of small children into a career, working at a daycare. Spending her days with kids at the age she herself was when so many people were watching and wondering and arguing about her future. That future turned out to be warm and small and full of children who will never know that the woman reading to them was once the most photographed infant in the country. Bobby and Kenny McCaughey became empty nesters in a house that was built to hold 9 people. They eventually sold the large home that had been donated to them, transferring it to a non-profit organization that now uses it to provide shelter and support to young mothers navigating difficult circumstances. It is a detail that says something about how the McCaughey's understood what had been given to them, not as a possession to keep, but as something to pass forward. On the rare occasions when all 7 siblings return to the same place at the same time, they fall back into the rhythms of people who grew up in close quarters. Inside jokes that don't need explaining. Familiar roles. The particular shorthand of people who have known each other longer than they have known anything else in the world. Some of them have children of their own now. There are small people in this extended family who are learning to ride bikes and throw tantrums and ask impossible questions in the same general geography where national conversation once raged about whether they should exist at all. They exist. All 7 of them. That is the largest fact of the story, and it sits differently now than it did in 1997, when it was a medical marvel. Now it sits like something quieter, Like something that happened, was survived, was built upon, and became ordinary in the best possible way. The question Bobby and Kenny faced in that consultation room does not have a clean answer. Both things the doctors predicted were true. 7 survived. 2 of them carry the marks of the prematurity that was always the central risk. A family was built that was larger and louder and more complicated than anyone had planned for. 2 people with cerebral palsy built independent lives in a world that does not always make that easy. A soldier, a carpenter, a trainer, 2 tech workers, a daycare teacher, and a medical receptionist grew out of a 6-minute delivery in a crowded Iowa operating room in November of 1997. Were Bobby and Kenny right? That depends entirely on what framework you bring to the question. From a purely medical standpoint, the outcome included exactly the complications that were predicted. From a human standpoint, 7 people are alive who otherwise would not be, and each of them is living a life that is entirely their own. The honest answer is that both of those facts are true at the same time, and they resist being resolved into a single verdict. What is not in dispute is this. A quiet couple from a small town in Iowa faced a moment that no set of instructions could have prepared them for, made a decision rooted in the deepest part of who they were, and then lived with every consequence of it, good and hard and everything in between. And the 7 human beings who came from that decision grew up, spread out, built things, served their country, raised children, and became people. Ordinary, remarkable, entirely their own. The most famous babies in America in 1997 became people you would walk past without recognition in 2025. They became, at last, exactly what their parents had always wanted. Just a family.